Was wäre, wenn die älteste Geschichte, die wir je erzählt haben, gar nicht der Anfang war? Was, wenn sie nur der letzte Laut von etwas viel Älterem war? Unter den Wüsten des südlichen Irak, wo die Luft leise vor Hitze summt und der Sand die Farbe der Zeit verbirgt, flüstern Tonstücke noch immer in vergessenen Sprachen. Jede Spur, die vor 5000 Jahren in die feuchte Erde gedrückt wurde, sollte eine Wahrheit bewahren. Doch nun schlummert die Wahrheit unter Schichten zerbrochener Ruinen und Stille und wartet auf jemanden, der ihr zuhört. Bevor ihr es euch also zu gemütlich macht, nehmt euch einen Moment Zeit, um dieses Video zu liken und den Kanal zu abonnieren. Nur, wenn ihr Geschichten mögt, die zwischen Traum und Geschichte schweben. Und wenn ihr noch wach seid, schreibt mir in die Kommentare, wo ihr zuhört und wie spät es dort ist. Ich stelle mir vor, wie diese Stille die ganze Welt umspannt. Die Geschichte beginnt nicht mit einer Entdeckung, sondern mit Staub. Ende des 19. Jahrhunderts drangen britische und französische Ausgräber in die Ebenen nahe des heutigen Uruk und Ur ein. Ihre Schaufeln stießen auf Ton, der durch Jahrhunderte des Vergessens verhärtet war. Tontafeln übereinander gestapelt wie die eingefrorene Erinnerung eines ganzen Volkes. Sie wurden die Sumerer genannt. Und von dem Moment an, als ihr Name wieder ausgesprochen wurde, begann etwas Seltsames in unserer Zeitrechnung zu geschehen. Denn was sie hinterließen, war nicht die unsichere Schrift eines jungen Volkes. Sie war bereits komplex, durchdacht und zeugte von einem tiefen Verständnis des Universums. Die frühesten sumerischen Aufzeichnungen tauchen um 3500 vor Christus wie aus dem Nichts auf. Ohne jegliches langsames Wachstum im Vorfeld war ihre Sprache voll entwickelt, ihre Stadtpläne perfekt ausgerichtet, ihre Raumkarten bereits präzise. Sie bauten Tempel, Zikkurats, Bewässerungssysteme und Rechensysteme, die noch heute das Gerüst unseres Kalenders bilden. Es war, als ob sich der Vorhang plötzlich für ein Volk gelüftet hätte, das in voller Blüte stand und dann so seltsam verschwand, wie es aufgetaucht war. Experten haben lange darum gerungen, diese Plötzlichkeit zu erklären. Die Geschichte bevorzugt langsamen Fortschritt, allmähliche Erfindungen, ein Werkzeug führt zum nächsten. Doch die Sumerer stellen diesen Rhythmus in Frage. Sie sprachen von einer Zeit vor Königen, vor Sintfluten, als Wissen weitergegeben wurde. Sie nannten ihre Lehrer nicht Menschen, sondern Götter, die vom Himmel herabstiegen. Und obwohl diese Sprache später mit Mythen umhüllt wurde, wirkt ihr Fundament älter als jede Metapher. Der Ton lügt nicht, er erinnert sich. Stellen Sie sich vor, Sie hielten eine dieser Tontafeln warm in der Hand, ihre keilförmigen Zeichen noch immer die Berührung einer Hand tragend, die vor jedem uns bekannten Reich lebte. Die Schrift, die Keilschrift, war nicht nur ein Alphabet, sondern eine Form der Bedeutung. Dreiecke, Linien und Einschnitte, jedes so angeordnet, dass es sowohl Laut als auch Symbol enthielt. Durch diese Zeichen hielten sie Medizin, Handel, Hymnen, Verträge und sogar Sternbewegungen fest. Eine Tafel listet die Phasen der Venus mit einer Genauigkeit auf, die wir erst mit modernen Teleskopen bestätigen konnten. Eine andere beschreibt die Bahnen von Jupiter und Mars. Und dann sind da die Geschichten von Enki und Enlil, von Anu, von der Schöpfung, geformt aus Erde und göttlichem Geist. Es ist leicht, Mythologie als Erfindung abzutun, aber wenn Mythen dasselbe Muster über Kontinente hinweg wiederholen, beginnt die Stille zwischen den Zeilen zu summen. Die Sumerer sprachen von einer großen Flut, die eine frühere Welt untergehen ließ. Dieselbe Geschichte findet sich in akkadischen, hebräischen, hinduistischen und sogar mesoamerikanischen Texten. Wie konnten Kulturen, die durch Ozeane getrennt waren, sich an dieselbe Katastrophe erinnern? Vielleicht treibt die Erinnerung selbst wie Staub und setzt sich dort ab, wo das Bewusstsein Raum findet. Oder vielleicht teilten die Alten mehr, als wir uns vorstellen können. Als Ausgräber die Stadt Uruk freilegten, erwarteten sie primitive Anfänge. Stattdessen fanden sie 6 Meilen lange Stadtmauern, riesige Tempel, die auf Himmelsrichtungen ausgerichtet waren, und Beweise für fortgeschrittene Metallverarbeitung. Unter einer Zikkurat gruben sie eine Bibliothek mit über 40.000 Tontafeln aus, ein Volk, das sich mit erstaunlicher Detailgenauigkeit dokumentierte und uns dennoch mit mehr Fragen als Antworten zurückließ. Wie lernten sie so viel so schnell? Woher stammte ihre Mathematik, die auf 60 und nicht auf 10 basierte? Warum kartierten sie den Himmel mit solcher Vertrautheit, als erinnerten sie sich, anstatt ihn zu entdecken? Einige Forscher vermuten, dass Sumer aus Jahrhunderten vergessener Entwicklung hervorging, einer Reihe kleiner Siedlungen, die durch Erosion und Überschwemmungen verloren gingen. Manche flüstern, die Sumerer hätten ihr Wissen von einem noch älteren Volk erhalten, das durch die Katastrophen am Ende der letzten Eiszeit ausgelöscht wurde. Und dann gibt es jene, die die Tontafeln Wort für Wort lesen und die Götter, die vom Himmel herabstiegen, nicht im spirituellen Sinne göttlich waren, sondern Lehrer, Reisende oder vielleicht Überreste eines Volkes, das uns gänzlich vorausging. Doch selbst die Zweifler räumen etwas Merkwürdiges ein: die sumerische Chronologie passt nicht. Völker sollten nicht vollständig strukturiert erscheinen, doch hier taten sie es. Ackerbau, Schrift, Recht, Musik, Medizin, alles gleichzeitig. Die Tontafeln zeugen nicht von Versuch und Irrtum. Sie zeigen Fortschritt, als wäre das, was wir die Geburt der Zivilisation nennen, für sie ein Wiederaufbau gewesen. Im Museum des Alten Orients in Berlin ruht ein kleiner Tonzylinder hinter Glas. Die Inschriften auf seiner Oberfläche beschreiben den Bau eines Tempels zu Ehren von Inanna, der Göttin der Liebe und des Krieges. Doch unter den Widmungszellen sticht ein Satz hervor: Dies ist die Wiederherstellung dessen, was vorher war. Wiederherstellung, ein Wort, das Erinnerung bedeutet, nicht Erfindung. Es ist ein stilles Eingeständnis, dass selbst die Sumerer sich als Erben einer älteren Tradition sahen. Betrachtet man diese Objekte genauer, entdeckt man manchmal Fingerabdrücke im Ton, bevor er trocknete. Der Abdruck eines Schreibers, der vor 6000 Jahren gelebt haben mag, ein im Schlamm eingefrorener Puls. Und wenn man dieser Linie mit den Augen folgt, erkennt man, dass diese Hände vielleicht die letzten Überreste einer Zeit niedergeschrieben haben, die von Flut, Zeit oder vielleicht absichtlich ausgelöscht wurde. Die Stille zwischen diesen Zeilen ist schwer, als wäre etwas Großes verloren gegangen. So wie eine fehlende Note ein ganzes Lied überschatten kann. So wie eine verlorene Erinnerung im Halbschlaf lauert. Vielleicht flüstern uns diese Geschichten deshalb noch immer zu. Sie erinnern uns daran, dass das, was wir Geschichte nennen, vielleicht nur der Teil ist, der den Brand überstanden hat. Nachts, wenn die Museen schließen und die Lichter erlöschen, stelle ich mir vor, wie diese Tontafeln in der Dunkelheit atmen, jede einzelne die schwache Erinnerung an eine Welt in sich trägt, die wir nicht mehr wiedererkennen. Wir glauben, wir stünden am Anfang des Verstehens. Aber vielleicht sind wir das letzte Kapitel der Erinnerung. Und während der Wüstenwind über die Ruinen von Uruk streicht und uralten Staub in die nächsten 1000 Jahre trägt, meint man fast, die erste Zeile unserer vergessenen Geschichte zu hören, leise, unvollendet, darauf wartend, wieder gehört zu werden. Wenn die Sumerer nicht die Ersten waren, an wen erinnern sie sich dann? Sie sagten, das Königtum sei vom Himmel herabgekommen. Nicht symbolisch, nicht auf verschlungenen Wegen, sondern als Tatsachenbehauptung. Diese eine Zeile, vor über 4000 Jahren in Ton gemeißelt, schwingt noch immer mit einer Kraft mit, die sich der Sprache kaum entzieht. Nachdem das Königtum vom Himmel herabgekommen war, lag es in Eridu. Es ist der erste Vers dessen, was wir heute die Sumerische Königsliste nennen, ein Verzeichnis von Herrschern, deren Regierungszeiten weit über die Grenzen menschlicher Vorstellungskraft hinausreichen. Oberflächlich betrachtet liest sie sich wie ein historisches Dokument, Städte, Namen, Daten. Doch je weiter die Liste fortschreitet, desto unmöglicher werden die Zahlen. Ein König regierte 36.000 Jahre, ein anderer 28.000, ein weiterer 43.200. Insgesamt regierten 8 Herrscher die Welt, bevor eine große Flut das Land überschwemmte. Erst nach dieser Flut schrumpft die Überlieferung zu etwas Menschlicherem. Regierungszeiten von Jahrhunderten, dann Jahrzehnten. Experten versuchen seit Jahrhunderten, die Bedeutung dieser unvorstellbaren Zahlen zu entschlüsseln. Waren sie symbolisch, bezogen sie sich auf den Raum, vermittelten sie eine Lehre oder bewahrten sie eine Zeit, in der das Leben selbst anders verlief? Diese Frage hat etwas Beunruhigendes, etwas, das die Atmosphäre um diese Tontafeln schwer erscheinen lässt. Denn es waren keine bloßen Geschichten, sondern Geschäftsaufzeichnungen, geschrieben in derselben Handschrift, die Getreide, Schulden und Tempelopfer zählte. Für die Sumerer war diese Liste Erinnerung, kein Mythos. Und dieser Unterschied prägt alles daran. Die ältesten Abschriften wurden in den Ruinen von Lhasa und Nippur gefunden. Jede Version unterscheidet sich leicht, als wäre sie aus einer bereits verblassenden Erinnerung übersetzt worden. Doch die Struktur bleibt dieselbe. 8 Könige vor der Flut. Ihre Regierungszeiten wurden in Zehntausenden von Jahren gemessen, gefolgt von einem universellen Neustart. Dann erheben sich neue Könige. Uruk und Kish, beide beanspruchten göttliches Recht und führten ihre Herrschaft auf die Zeit vor der Sintflut zurück. Einige Historiker argumentieren, diese Zahlen spiegelten Mondzyklen oder einen symbolischen Kalender wider, der göttliche Autorität belegen sollte. Andere wiederum, die sich eingehend mit der eigentümlichen Exaktheit der sumerischen Mathematik befassen, bemerken, dass die Zahlen Vielfache von 3600 sind, der sumerischen Einheit Sa. Dies war kein Zufall. Es war dasselbe System, mit dem Umlaufbahnen, Sternzirkeln und Entfernungen gemessen wurden. Warum sollte ein königliches Register in räumlicher Notation verfasst sein? Es sei denn, die Könige selbst sollten als himmlische Wesen verstanden werden, als Herrscher über Zeitalter statt über Jahre. Die Königsliste gehört zu jenen Objekten, die man für unmöglich hält. Sie verbindet Mythos und Geschichte so nahtlos, dass Experten noch immer darüber streiten, wem sie zuzuordnen ist. Die Namen dieser alten Herrscher, Anulim, Alaingar und Menluana, tauchen nirgendwo sonst auf. Und doch existieren die Städte, die sie beherrschten. Eridu zum Beispiel existierte tatsächlich. Von Ausgräbern als die älteste Stadt Südmesopotamiens angesehen, stießen sie unter ihren Ruinen auf Schicht um Schicht von Bauwerken, die fast 8000 Jahre alt sind. Tempel wurden auf älteren Tempeln errichtet, jeder etwas kleiner als der vorherige, als ob er das langsame Schrumpfen der Zeit selbst widerspiegelte. Die Sumerer nannten Eridu die erste Stadt. Ihren Erzählungen zufolge wurde sie vom Gott Enki, dem Hüter des Wissens, gegründet, der die Menschheit aus Lehm formte. Ausgrabungen dort offenbaren ein komplexes Wassersystem, rituelle Altäre und Objekte aus Materialien, die in dieser Region eigentlich nicht hätten existieren dürfen. Steine aus fernen Bergen, Muscheln aus dem Indischen Ozean, ein Handelsnetzwerk oder Überreste von etwas Älterem, vielleicht beides. Wenn die Königsliste die Sintflut beschreibt, die die Herrschaft der alten Könige beendete, verwendet sie eine Sprache, die späteren Texten erstaunlich ähnelt. Dann kam die Flut. Keine Erklärung, kein göttliches Urteil, nur ein Ereignis, das die Zeit zurücksetzt. Unter Ur legten Ausgräber in den 1920er Jahren eine fast 2 Meter dicke Schicht sauberer, leerer Erde frei. Ein Beweis für eine gewaltige Flut um 2900 vor Christus. Sie begrub alles unter sich und versiegelte ein Zeitalter unter dem anderen. Es liegt nahe, dies als Beweis zu deuten, doch wahre Beweise liefern diese Erzählungen nie. Sie bieten Andeutungen, Schatten, Erinnerungen. In der Stille eines Museums, vor der Königstafel stehend, fällt einem vielleicht auf, wie sorgfältig jeder Keilstrich gesetzt ist. Kein Zögern. Der Verfasser glaubte an die Genauigkeit jeder Zahl. Und doch wirkt es, als hätte er etwas noch Älteres kopiert, etwas, das über Generationen weitergegeben wurde, ohne dass man seinen Ursprung verstand. Das Fremdartige verstärkt sich, wenn man erkennt, dass fast jede antike Kultur ein Echo dieser Ordnung teilt: göttliche Herrscher, gewaltige Flut, Neubeginn. Der ägyptische Turiner Papyrus listet Götter und Halbgötter auf, die vor den menschlichen Pharaonen herrschten. Die hinduistischen Puranas beschreiben gewaltige Yugas, Zeitalter von Zehntausenden von Jahren, die in Flut und Feuer enden. Der Maya-Schriftzug Chiram erzählt von früheren Welten, die von Wasser und Zeit zerstört wurden. Immer dasselbe Muster: Herrschaft vom Himmel, Fall ins Chaos, Wiedergeburt durch die Sintflut. Es ist, als erinnere sich die Menschheit an den Rhythmus, aber nicht an die Melodie. Die Details ändern sich, die Namen wechseln. Doch die Struktur bleibt bestehen, ein halb erinnerter Traum, der sich über Kontinente wiederholt. Einige Forscher, wie Zecharia Sitchin, argumentierten, die Königsliste bewahre Aufzeichnungen von Wesen, die nicht gänzlich menschlich waren. Jene, die von den Sternen kamen, lehrten die Menschheit und herrschten, bis die Sintflut sie hinwegraffte. Seine Interpretationen, obwohl umstritten, fanden Anklang, denn die Fragen, die die Tafeln aufwerfen, lassen sich nicht aus der Welt schaffen. Selbst traditionelle Ausgräber, die die Theorie außerirdischer Herkunft ablehnen, geben zu, dass der Beginn der sumerischen Zivilisation seltsam anmutet, ein Funke ohne Zündholz. Andere sehen in der Liste einen verborgenen wissenschaftlichen Kalender. Die langen Regierungszeiten könnten Prozessionszyklen oder kosmische Zeitalter darstellen. Wenn die Herrschaft Alulims 28.800 Jahre dauerte, markierte sie vielleicht eine himmlische Konstellation, einen Rhythmus des Himmels, der auf der Erde wiedergespiegelt wurde. Die Sumerer ließen oft die Grenzen zwischen Himmel und Erde verschwimmen. Ihre Götter waren die Planeten selbst, ihre Mythen die Sprache von Umlaufbahn und Licht. Vielleicht war die Königsliste weniger ein Herrschaftsbericht als vielmehr eine Karte der universellen Ordnung, ein Zeugnis der Zeit vor der Zeit. Dennoch lässt sich ihre emotionale Wucht nicht leugnen. Unter all den Zahlen und Theorien liegt in diesen Tafeln eine tiefe Traurigkeit, das Gefühl, dass einst etwas Wunderbares existierte und alles danach nur noch sein Schatten war. Als die Sintflut hereinbrach, starb die alte Welt, und die Erinnerung wurde zum Mythos. Die Sumerer errichteten ihre Tempel als Akte der Erinnerung, nicht aus Ehrgeiz. Sie bauten wieder auf, sie begannen nicht von Neuem. Man kann diese Sehnsucht fast in ihren Hymnen hören, Liedern an Götter, die nicht mehr erhörten, Gebeten an Ahnen, die zu Staub zerfallen sind. Die Königsliste war vielleicht weniger ein Dokument der Macht als vielmehr ein Gebet, ein Versuch, an einer Welt festzuhalten, die sie nicht mehr sehen konnten, einer Welt, die sie vielleicht selbst nicht vollständig verstanden. In einer der erhaltenen Zeilen, nach der Sintflut, heißt es schlicht: Dann wurde die Königsherrschaft wieder vom Himmel herabgesetzt, als ob die Geschichte selbst zyklisch wäre, herab und zurückströmend wie die Gezeiten. Jedes Zeitalter, jedes Volk, jeder Aufstieg und Fall nur ein weiterer Versuch, sich an das zu erinnern, was beim ersten Mal verloren ging. Vielleicht suchen wir deshalb noch immer in der Wüste nach ihren Spuren. Nicht um Antworten zu finden, sondern um diesen Rhythmus wieder zu spüren, den langsamen Puls einer Welt, die älter ist als die Geschichte. Wenn die Zeit schon einmal begann, kann sie dann wieder beginnen? Es ist ein stilles Staunen, wenn man erkennt, wie viel die Alten über den Himmel wussten. Nicht als etwas Unklares, nicht als ein Bild des Staunens, sondern als ein System, das sie offenbar schon lange vor der Erfindung des Teleskops erfasst hatten. Die Sumerer blickten nicht einfach nur nach oben. Sie maßen, dokumentierten und richteten ihre Welt nach dem aus, was sie sahen. Ihre Tempel wurden exakt nach den Bahnen des Weltraums ausgerichtet. Ihre Götter waren die Planeten. Ihr Kalender folgte den komplexen Rhythmen von Venus und Jupiter mit einer Genauigkeit, die wir erst Jahrtausende später wieder entdecken sollten. Und dieses Wissen tauchte irgendwie nicht am Ende eines langen Lernprozesses auf, sondern ganz am Anfang. Wenn man durch die Ruinen von Ur oder Nippur wandert und dort steht, wo einst die Zikkurats in den Himmel ragten, offenbart die Form ihrer Fundamente etwas Merkwürdiges. Jeder bedeutende Tempel ist auf einen bestimmten Punkt im Weltraum ausgerichtet, den Aufgang eines bestimmten Sterns, die Sonnenwendelinie, den Punkt, an dem die Venus im Morgengrauen erscheint. Die große Zikkurat von Ur beispielsweise ist fast perfekt nach Norden ausgerichtet, ihre Ecken zeigen in die Himmelsrichtungen. Eine Meisterleistung der Bewusstseinsbildung, die sowohl mathematische Fähigkeiten als auch die Beobachtung des Weltraums voraussetzt. Und doch wurden diese Bauwerke vor fast 6000 Jahren errichtet, zu einer Zeit, als der größte Teil der Weltbevölkerung noch in verstreuten Stämmen lebte. Unter den Tausenden von Tontafeln, die in Mesopotamien ausgegraben wurden, findet sich eine kleine Gruppe mit unerwarteten Aufzeichnungen, geordnete Sternenkarten, die sogenannten Mulapin-Tafeln, die vermutlich aus der altbabylonischen Zeit stammen, aber viel älteres sumerisches Wissen bewahren. Sie listen Sternbilder, Tag- und Nachtgleichen, Sonnenwenden sowie die Auf- und Untergangszeiten der Planeten auf. Manche Experten vermuten, dass die dort niedergeschriebenen Beobachtungen aus der Zeit um 3000 vor Christus stammen könnten, möglicherweise sogar noch früher. Wie konnten sie den exakten Venuszyklus von 584,92 Tagen mit einer Fehlertoleranz von weniger als einem Tag kennen? Die moderne Wissenschaft berechnet mit all ihren Instrumenten die Präzession der Tag- und Nachtgleichen mit etwa einem Grad alle 72 Jahre. Doch im alten Sumer zeigen Schriften bereits ein Verständnis für diese langsame Bewegung der Sterne. Um diese zu messen, bräuchte man jahrhundertelange, ununterbrochene Beobachtung oder Aufzeichnungen eines Volkes, das diese Bewegungen bereits beobachtet hatte. Die Sumerer hinterließen uns weder Teleskope noch formale Erklärungen, nur Mythen, doch ihre Mythen sprechen die Sprache der Daten. Die mit der Venus in Verbindung gebrachte Göttin Inanna soll in die Unterwelt hinabgestiegen und wieder auferstanden sein. Ihre Geschichte spiegelt das Verschwinden und Wiedererscheinen des Planeten am Himmel wider. Der Mondgott Nanna war der Hüter der Zyklen, sein Tempel die große Sternwarte von Ur. Die 7 großen Götter entsprachen den 7 klassischen Planeten. Selbst der Begriff Anunnaki, oft übersetzt als die vom Himmel zur Erde gekommenen, birgt eine doppelte Bedeutung. Mythologische Wesen, ja, aber auch die Gezählten des Anu, ein Ausdruck, der im Sumerischen auch die gezählten Himmelskörper bezeichnet. Es ist verlockend, zu viel in Zufälle hinein zu interpretieren. Doch die Beständigkeit dieser Muster über Städte und Zeitalter hinweg deutet eher auf einen Zweck als auf Zufall hin. Jeder Tempel, jedes Ritual, jedes Festdatum spiegelte die Drehung des Himmels wider. Sie trennten Religion nicht von Wissenschaft, Mythos nicht von Beobachtung. Für sie war das Universum ein einziges atmendes System, seine Bewegung heilig, seine Zahlen göttlich. Doch woher rührte dieses Bewusstsein? Hat ein Volk, das gerade erst die Steinzeit hinter sich gelassen hatte, tatsächlich allein eine so ausgefeilte Weltraumkunde entwickelt? 1899 entdeckte der deutsche Ausgräber Hugo Winkler in Boğazköy in Anatolien Tontafeln, Texte, die die sumerische Sternenkunde mit der späteren hethitischen und chaldäischen verknüpften. Auffallend ist die Kontinuität, dieselben Sternbilder, dieselben Muster der Planetenverehrung, die über Jahrtausende nahezu unverändert weitergegeben wurden. Solche Genauigkeit wird normalerweise nicht mündlich überliefert. Sie überlebt nur durch schriftliche Aufzeichnungen oder erhaltene Lehrsysteme. Das bedeutet, die Sumerer erfanden die Astronomie nicht. Sie dokumentierten etwas bereits Bekanntes. Auf einer Tontafel aus der Bibliothek von Ninive, die heute im Britischen Museum aufbewahrt wird, hatte ein Schreiber sorgfältig die Bahn des Jupiters am Nachthimmel eingezeichnet und dabei ein kompliziertes mathematisches System verwendet, das moderne Weltraumforscher als eine Grundform der Infinitesimalrechnung erkannten. Eine andere Tafel beschreibt den Schatten der Erde vor dem Mond während einer Finsternis und vermerkt, dass der Gott verschlungen wird, aber zurückkehrt. Hinter der Poesie verbirgt sich das Verständnis von Umlaufbahn und Form. Und wenn dieselben Schreiber den Himmel als die Tafeln des Schicksals bezeichneten, war das keine poetische Übertreibung. Sie sprachen die ungeschminkte Wahrheit ihrer Weltanschauung aus, dass die Sterne das Schicksal aufzeichneten. Das hat etwas fast Beängstigendes. Ein Volk, das in Lehm- und Schilfhütten lebte und dessen Bauern vom Hochwasser der Flüsse abhängig waren, schrieb über die mathematische Exaktheit des Universums, als hätten sie es bereits vollständig erfasst. Und vielleicht hatten sie das in gewisser Weise auch. Einige Forscher sehen in ihrem auf der Zahl 60 basierenden Zahlensystem eine Widerspiegelung der 12 Hauptsternbilder des Tierkreises, jener Himmelsunterteilung, die wir noch heute verwenden. Andere verweisen auf die sumerische Betonung der Zahl 60, die sich überall in ihren Messungen findet, als Beweis für eine Kodierung des Raumes. 60 Minuten, 60 Sekunden, 360 Grad. Selbst unsere modernen Uhren weisen noch immer Ähnlichkeiten mit ihrem Design auf. Der Rhythmus unserer Zeitmessung selbst stammt von ihrem. Und dann gibt es noch die Geschichten, die selbst die sorgfältigsten Experten beunruhigen. In einer Reihe von Tontafeln aus Sippa unterweist der Gott Enki die Menschheit in den Maßen des Himmels und lehrt sie, Instrumente zu bauen, um das Unsichtbare sichtbar zu machen. Ein anderes Stück beschreibt eine Glaskammer, die die Augen vergrößert. Manche verstehen dies als Metapher, andere als verlorene Technologie, eine poetische Erinnerung an Linsen oder frühe Teleskope. Tatsächlich wurden in mesopotamischen Städten kleine Bergkristalllinsen gefunden, deren Zweck jedoch weiterhin diskutiert wird. Waren sie Schmuck oder Beobachtungsinstrumente? Je mehr wir lesen, desto schwieriger wird es, ihr Glaubenssystem von unserem zu trennen. Die Sumerer beobachteten den Himmel nicht einfach nur. Sie glaubten, er sei lebendig. Jeder Planet hatte einen eigenen Willen, eine eigene Persönlichkeit, eine Umlaufbahn, die die moralische Ordnung widerspiegelte. Die Bewegung der Sterne war nicht mechanisch, sondern spirituell. Und doch sind ihre Aufzeichnungen mathematisch präzise. Irgendwie gelang es ihnen, Mythos und Messung ohne Widerspruch miteinander zu verbinden. Vielleicht ist es das, was die Moderne verloren hat, die Fähigkeit, Genauigkeit und Staunen als Einheit zu begreifen. Würde man einen sumerischen Priester und Weltraumforscher fragen, woher er sein Wissen hatte, würde er vielleicht einfach sagen, es sei ihm gegeben. Und vielleicht meinte er damit nicht Götter aus Fleisch und Feuer, sondern das Universum selbst, etwas, das durch Beobachtung, Rituale, Geduld und Erinnerung empfangen wurde. Doch selbst diese Erklärung lässt etwas unausgesprochen, denn ihr Wissen erscheint zu umfassend für ihre damalige Welt, zu sorgfältig für bloßen Zufall. War es das Überbleibsel eines vergessenen Zeitalters, ein Geschenk von Menschen, die den Himmel bereits vor der Sintflut kartiert hatten? Oder ist es einfach der Beweis dafür, dass die Genialität der Menschheit schon immer älter war, als wir annehmen? So oder so, wenn die Sonne über den Ruinen von Ur untergeht und die ersten Sterne über der Wüste erstrahlen, ist es leicht zu glauben, dass die Sumerer noch immer zusehen. Ihre Umrisse sind erhalten geblieben, in die Erde gemeißelt. Die Winkel ihrer Tempel fangen noch immer das Licht derselben Sterne ein, die sie einst beobachteten. Ihre Mythen bewegen sich noch immer im Rhythmus der Planetenbahnen. Und irgendwo in diesem Rhythmus schlummert die Erinnerung an eine Zeit, als Wissenschaft und Göttlichkeit ein und dieselbe Sprache waren. Die Götter, die den Himmel vermessen haben, waren vielleicht nur Menschen. Oder vielleicht wurden die Menschen, die den Himmel beobachteten, im Akt des Messens selbst zu Göttern. Wenn sie ihr Wissen erhielten, von wem dann? Zwischen den zerbrochenen Fundamenten des alten Sumer, zwischen Ziegelbruchstücken und gebranntem Lehm, haben Ausgräber etwas still Erstaunliches entdeckt, Beweise für eine Technologie, die zu Beginn der Zivilisation eigentlich nicht existieren dürfte. Werkzeuge aus Bronze, die vor der Bronzezeit auftauchten. Perfekt geformte Bohrungen in Dioritgestein. Tontafeln, die komplexe Mischungen aus Mineralien und Metallen beschreiben. Selbst das Wort, das sie für Wissen verwendeten, ich, bedeutete nicht Lernen in dem Sinne, wie wir es heute verstehen. Es bedeutete etwas Ähnliches wie Codes, Formeln oder grundlegende Ordnungsgesetze. Für die Sumerer war Wissenschaft keine Erfindung, sondern Erinnerung. Als bei Ausgrabungen in Eridu und Ur Tontafeln mit Beschreibungen zum Bau von Zigguraten entdeckt wurden, erwarteten Forscher frühe Baupläne, grobe Skizzen von Lehm- und Schilfkonstruktionen. Stattdessen fanden sie Maße, ausgebogene Verhältnisse und Winkel, beschrieben im 60er-System, demselben System, das wir noch heute zur Messung von Kreisen und Zeit verwenden. Ihre Erbauer berechneten Volumen, Neigungen und Gewichtsverteilung mit beängstigender Genauigkeit, was auf ein praktisches Verständnis von Formgebung hindeutet, Jahrhunderte bevor die Griechen diesem Begriff einen Namen gaben. Es ist, als hätten sie ein Ingenieurhandbuch aus einer verschollenen Quelle erhalten, dem sie folgen konnten, das sie aber vielleicht nicht mehr vollständig erklären konnten. Selbst im Alltag war ihr wissenschaftliches Bewusstsein allgegenwärtig. Bauern hielten die Mondphasen fest, um Bewässerungszyklen vorherzusagen. Ärzte notierten Symptome und Behandlungen auf Tontafeln, die wie frühe medizinische Aufzeichnungen klingen. Eine Tontafel aus Nippur listet über 200 Heilpflanzen nach ihrer Funktion geordnet auf. Eine andere Beschreibung erläutert das Mischen von Schwefel, Kupfer und Öl zur Herstellung von Verbindungen, die in Reinigungsritualen verwendet wurden, Formeln, die an frühe Chemie erinnern. Es gibt sogar Erwähnungen von etwas namens Nigar, übersetzt als glänzende Flüssigkeit, bei dem es sich nach Ansicht mancher um destilliertes Quecksilber handelt, obwohl ein solches Material zu jener Zeit eigentlich unbekannt gewesen sein dürfte. Je tiefer man blickt, desto deutlicher werden diese Spuren vergessener Wissenschaft. Nehmen wir die Metallverarbeitung. Um 3000 vor Christus schmolzen die Sumerer Kupfer und experimentierten mit Legierungen. Doch in den Ruinen von Tel Asmar und Kisch fanden Metallarbeiter Spuren von gehärteter Bronze, die aus der Zeit vor diesem Zeitpunkt stammen. Metall, das auf ein früheres, fortgeschritteneres Verständnis des Schmelzens hindeutet. In derselben Region zeigen Zylindersägelsägen, Bohrer und Blasebälge. Dies beweist zwar nicht die Existenz von Maschinen im heutigen Sinne, aber es zeigt, dass ihre Handwerkskunst ein Niveau erreichte, das sich mit den gefundenen Werkzeugen nicht erklären lässt. Und dann ist da noch die Mathematik selbst, die Sprache ihrer Welt. Das von ihnen verwendete Zahlensystem zur Basis 60 ermöglichte Bruchrechnungen, Raumeinteilungen und Zeitberechnungen, die weit über die Bedürfnisse einfacher Landwirtschaft hinausgingen. Den Himmel in 360 Grad zu unterteilen, eine Stunde in 60 Minuten zu messen, erforderte nicht Fantasie, sondern Geschichte. Einige Historiker argumentieren, ihr System müsse aus langjähriger Beobachtung, vielleicht über Jahrtausende hinweg, entstanden sein. Andere vermuten, diese Genauigkeit sei bereits vorhanden gewesen, ein Überbleibsel aus einer früheren Zeit. Einige Experten gingen noch weiter. In den 1920er Jahren vermutete der Experte George Louis, dass das sumerische Fachvokabular Lehnwörter aus einer unbekannten, nicht-semitischen Sprache enthielt, Spuren eines ausgestorbenen wissenschaftlichen Wortschatzes. Er nannte ihn die Grundlage der Erfindung. Wir wissen nicht, wer ihn sprach, nur dass seine Überreste wie Fossilien im sumerischen Sprachgebrauch erhalten geblieben sind. Vielleicht gehören diese Wörter eben jenem Volk, an das sich die Sumerer zu erinnern behaupten, dem Volk vor der Sintflut. Für moderne Ohren klingt das nach Mythenbildung, doch Mythen haben die seltsame Angewohnheit, technische Wahrheiten in symbolischer Form zu bewahren. Betrachten wir den Gott Enki, Herrn der Tiefen und Hüter der Weisheit. Im Mythos von Enki und Inanna sendet er das Mi der Zivilisation, eine Reihe von Tafeln mit den Codes für Musik, Bauwesen, Recht und Handwerk. Jedes Mi ist ein Prinzip, eine Formel. Als Inanna sie in ihre Stadt bringt, erwacht die Zivilisation selbst. Die Geschichte ist spirituell, aber auch erstaunlich wörtlich. Sie beschreibt die Weitergabe von Wissen, als käme sie von einer älteren zu einer jüngeren Quelle. Die Götter sind keine Erfinder, sondern Bewahrer. Dieses Wort Bewahrer könnte den Schlüssel bergen. Die Sumerer beanspruchten nie das Eigentum an ihren Wissenschaften. Sie beschrieben sich selbst als Empfänger, als Verwalter himmlischer Gaben. Ihre Schreiber erlernten die Formenlehre und die Raumlehre nicht als menschliche Errungenschaften, sondern als göttliche Gabe. Und in ihren Ritualen bedeutete das Lehren oder Verkünden von Wissen, die Schöpfung selbst neu zu erschaffen. Eine Mahnung, dass Weisheit bewahrt und nicht erfunden werden muss. Man könnte versucht sein, ihre Wissenschaft als zufällige Genialität zu betrachten, als ein Zusammentreffen kluger Bauern und wachsamer Priester. Doch es gibt Details, die sich einer Vereinfachung entziehen. 1936 entdeckten Ausgräber in Sippa eine Tontafel mit einer Liste von Geometrieaufgaben, darunter die Berechnung eines rechtwinkligen Dreiecks mithilfe des späteren Satzes des Pythagoras. Dies sind keine unbeholfenen Versuche eines Anfängers, sondern Überbleibsel eines bereits ausgereiften Systems. Selbst ihre Kunst birgt mathematische Geheimnisse. Die Größen ihrer Statuen folgten oft harmonischen Verhältnissen, denselben ausgewogenen Systemen, die später in der klassischen griechischen Skulptur gefeiert wurden. Die Tempel von Uruk und Eridu sind im Maßstab 3:4:5 errichtet, der einfachsten Form des rechten Winkels. Es ist, als hätten sie verstanden, dass Schönheit, Struktur und Klang Ausdruck desselben universellen Musters sind. Dieses Echo reichte über Mesopotamien hinaus. Etwa zur gleichen Zeit verwendeten die Erbauer der frühesten ägyptischen Tempel ähnliche Maße. Im Industal folgten die Stadtpläne strengen Rastern. In jeder Region erscheint die früheste Phase der Zivilisation nicht roh, sondern sorgfältig, als ob sie auf eine Erinnerung reagierte, die über die Geografie hinausging. Experten nennen dies das Synchronisationsproblem, die unwahrscheinliche gleichzeitige Entstehung komplexer Stadtplanungen um 3000 vor Christus. Warum begann die Menschheit gleichzeitig mit mathematischem Bewusstsein zu bauen? Warum nicht früher oder später? Manche argumentieren, dies spiegele ein gemeinsames Erwachen des menschlichen Geistes wider, einen Wendepunkt, als Sprache, Beobachtung und symbolisches Denken zusammenfanden. Andere sehen darin die Überreste von etwas Vorhergehendem, ein gemeinsames Erbe, das von jeder Kultur verstreut und anders erinnert wurde. Vielleicht entdeckten Sumer, Ägypten und das Industal die Zivilisation nicht unabhängig voneinander, sondern fanden jeweils Teile eines älteren Bauplans wieder. Die Sumerer selbst scheinen daran zu glauben, in ihren Hymnen wird die erste Stadt, Eridu, als aus dem Lehm der Tiefe emporgestiegen beschrieben, ihre Fundamente älter als der Himmel. Der Tempel des Gottes Enki, der Apsu, soll über den Wassern der Weisheit gelegen haben, die aus der Unterwelt flossen. Eine Metapher, ja, aber auch ein Bild der Kontinuität, des Wissens, das aus den Tiefen der Zeit an die Oberfläche tritt. Selbst ihre Klangmythologie trägt Echos wissenschaftlicher Ordnung in sich. Das Wort Enlil, oft als Herr der Luft übersetzt, kann auch die Schwingung bezeichnen, die sich durch den Raum bewegt. In rituellen Gesängen riefen Priester ihn als den Atem an, der die Welt formt, die unsichtbare Kraft, die der Materie Struktur verleiht. Für moderne Ohren klingt es seltsamerweise wie ein poetisches Verständnis von Frequenz und Resonanz, die Physik der Schwingung in heiliger Sprache. Sollten diese Parallelen Zufall sein, so sind sie doch tiefgreifend. Und doch, ob Zufall oder nicht, bleibt der Eindruck bestehen, dass die frühesten uns bekannten Menschen nicht nach Wissen strebten, sondern darum kämpften, es zu bewahren. Jede Gleichung, jeder Tempel, jede Tontafel wirkt wie ein Echo, eine Schallwelle aus einer älteren Zeit. Wir leben umgeben von den Überresten ihrer Systeme. Jedes Mal, wenn wir die Zeit messen, jedes Mal, wenn wir einen Kreis teilen, jedes Mal, wenn wir messen, wiederholen wir die Logik ihrer Welt. Sie lehren uns noch immer, obwohl ihre Namen zu Staub zerfallen sind. Vielleicht beginnt Zivilisation nicht mit der Erfindung von Wissen. Vielleicht beginnt sie mit dessen Wiederentdeckung, wenn das Schweigen des Vergessens bricht und ein Echo zurückkehrt. Doch wenn sich Sumer an Vergangenes erinnerte, welche Katastrophe hatte die Welt ausgelöscht, die sie so sorgsam wieder aufzubauen suchten? Lauscht man lange genug, beginnt Selbstton zu sprechen, begraben unter Jahrhunderten von Wind und Stille. Die Tontafeln von Nippur und Ninive bilden womöglich die ältesten Bibliotheken der Menschheitsgeschichte, Sammlungen von Recht, Medizin, Weltraumforschung und Ritualen. Doch sie sind mehr als nur Wissenssammlungen. Sie sind die eingefrorene Erinnerung eines Volkes, das verzweifelt versuchte, sein Wissen zu bewahren. Als diese Tafeln erstmals ausgegraben wurden, widerlegten sie die Vorstellung, die Menschen der Antike hätten in Unwissenheit gelebt. Stattdessen zeigten sie eine Welt von Schreibern, Experten und Denkern, die schrieben, als ob sie gegen das Verschwinden ankämpften. Die Stadt Nippur war keine königliche Hauptstadt. Sie hatte keinen König, keine Armeen, kein Reich. Und doch war sie das spirituelle Herz Sumers, Heimat des großen Tempels von Enlil, dem Herrn des Windes. Unter seinen Ruinen legten Ausgräber Zehntausende von Tontafeln frei, eine so gewaltige Sammlung, dass Experten noch heute einzelne Teile entschlüsseln. What they found changed everything. There were business lists, yes, but also poems, star maps, surgery instructions, even thinking reflections on fate and justice. Some of these texts come before the Bible by more than 1,000 years, yet they contain thoughts so familiar that they feel almost modern. Imagine standing in one of those rooms, the air thick with the smell of baked clay. Rows upon rows of tablets line the shelves, each one pressed with the angled marks of cuneiform, each one a voice kept. The scribes of Nippur were not mere record keepers. They were guardians of continuity. In their schools, young students learned not only to read and write, but to memorize entire lists of signs, hundreds, sometimes thousands of them. Learning to write in Sumer was an initiation into a secret order, an act of devotion as much as intellect. The clay tablet was their sacred object, their bridge to the past. The huge range of subjects kept there is staggering. One tablet details a code of rules for doctors. Do not cause harm by your hand. Do not hold back the cure. Another describes the structure of the liver in the practice of fortune-telling, an early observation of anatomy written in ritual language. Others list mineral substances used in dyes and medicines. Even more surprising are the space records, the risings of stars, the movements of the moon, and the prediction of eclipses. For a people we call the first, their thinking horizon was already huge. When the great flood of history finally drowned Sumer's cities through war, wearing away, and time, Nippur's tablets survived because they were clay. Fire and burial kept them where papyrus and parchment would have turned to dust. And so, thousands of years later, when Austin Henry Layard and Hormuz Sam began to dig at Nineveh in the mid-1800s, they stumbled upon something even greater. The library of Ashurbanipal, a king of Assyria. That library, though built more than 1,000 years after Nippur's golden age, was its heir. Within its walls, the Assyrian scribes had gathered and copied Sumerian and Babylonian texts, over 30,000 tablets in total. When the palace burnt, the heat hardened them into permanence. The result was a collection of universal scope, keeping stories, calculations, and prayers that would otherwise have vanished forever. Among them were pieces of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood story that came before Genesis. There were omens, star lists, dream guides, hymns to Inanna and Enki, and lists of kings stretching back into myth. Reading those tablets now, one feels a strange mixture of thanks and sadness. Thanks that the fire saved them. Sadness that the people they recorded was already fading when the copies were made. The scribes of Nineveh worked like diggers of their own past, keeping texts they themselves could barely understand. One colophon reads, from the old tablets, Damiget, restored with care. Another tablet bears the quiet signature of a scribe. I have written what was left to me. Those words echo across the centuries like a sad song. They knew they were writing at the end of something. The content of these libraries hints at a thinking line that challenges simple sorting. In the Enuma Anu Enlil, thousands of lines devoted to heavenly omens, each movement of a planet, each ring around the moon was recorded and understood as a reflection of divine will. Behind the poetry, however, lies organized observation, data covering generations. The Sumerians and their heirs were scientists in priestly robes, mathematicians speaking in myth. They did separate the physical from the sacred. For them to measure the heavens was to talk with the gods. One of the most haunting discoveries in Nineveh's collection is the so-called Tablet of the Great Flood. It tells of a man chosen to survive the huge flood, commanded by a god to build a vessel and keep life. The parallels to Noah's story are unmistakable, but this version is older, perhaps the original. The flood, it says, swept over like a wind, erasing kings and cities alike. When the waters pulled back, kingship came down again from heaven. The cycle started again. The story is both myth and record, memory and metaphor. It is easy to read these texts as distant curiosities, but they were not written for us. They were written for continuity, for a future they hoped would still understand. Each tablet was a time capsule, a plea against erasure. The scribes must have known that empires fall and tongues vanish. They wrote anyway, trusting clay more than stone. And perhaps they were right. Because long after their cities collapsed, their words endure. Their numbers define our clocks. Their shape forms our buildings. Their myths live in our religions. Even their fears of flood, of forgetting remain ours. Every modern library is in a sense a descendant of Nippur and Nineveh. Each shelf a new layer of clay. But there's another layer to this story, one rarely spoken out loud. Some pieces from these ancient libraries describe devices, instruments, and processes that seem out of place in their time. 1. Tablet speaks of a vessel of shining copper that stores the fire of heaven. Another mentions crystal that brings light to darkness. Experts understand these as metaphors for ritual objects. Yet one wonders, were they metaphors or faint echoes of lost technologies whose purposes we can no longer imagine? Even their writing system feels like a machine of keeping. Cuneiform could record both sound and idea, a mixed code that could survive translation. It was strong, adaptable, modular. When the Greeks later adopted the concept of the written collection, they did so under the shadow of Nineveh's example. The library as an idea began in Sumer. Standing before those tablets today under the clean light of museums, it is difficult not to feel the pull of that ancient purpose to remember. They knew knowledge could vanish. They saw it happen before. Perhaps that's why they wrote so focused, so completely. Every wedge in clay was an act of fighting against the flood. But if the Sumerians and their heirs were merely keeping what they already knew, what then had they lost? What deeper collection lies still buried beneath the layers of time, waiting for another people to find it, to read, to wonder, and to ask the same unanswerable question? In the oldest stories ever written, humanity is not born. It is made. The Sumerians told of gods who worked to shape the world and of a moment when they grew tired of their endless work. It was then they said that Enki, the god of wisdom, and Ninhursag, the lady of life, gathered the spirit of the divine and mixed it with the clay of the earth. From this mixing came the first humans, Lulu Amilu, servants who could bear the burdens of creation. It is a tale half myth, half memory. Yet behind its poetry hides something more. An idea so ancient and so bold that it still unsettles us. That life itself may be the result of design. The Atrahasis epic carved into tablets long before the book of Genesis describes the gods meeting. Enlil, their leader, complains about the noise of the lesser beings who work in the fields. Enki offers a solution. They will fashion a new race to work in their place. But the raw clay alone is lifeless. To bring it alive, they need something of themselves. So they sacrifice a god. His blood mixed with the earth, his spirit divided among humankind. And thus through an act of divine rule-breaking, we are born both mortal and sacred, both servant and heir. It is an origin that feels older than any religion, part biology, part mystery. What were the Sumerians trying to tell us? Did they imagine this story as pure teaching story? Or were they recording something remembered from a time so far removed that it could only survive in mythic form? Diggers have long treated such tales as metaphors for the dawn of civilization, the moment when humanity learned farming, law, and writing. But what if the story's deeper meaning is word for word in ways we can no longer see? The phrase mixed with the blood of the gods appears again and again across Mesopotamian texts. In Akkadian texts like Enuma Elish, the genetic spirit of the divine was described as a life-bearing fluid, a seed of heaven. The same idea echoes in Egypt, in Greece, in the Hebrew Bible. The human body, they believed, carried pieces of something older, something heavenly. Modern readers tend to separate myth from science. Yet when one looks closely, the distance between them narrows. The Sumerians described a process of creation that involves the handling of flesh and blood, matter filled with intention. In the myth of Enki and Ninmah, the gods try repeatedly, creating beings that fail, one blind, one mute, one unable to reproduce, until finally they succeed. The story reads like an ancient teaching story of trial and error, a poetic reflection of some forgotten knowledge of human body parts or heredity. Perhaps not word for word trying, but a symbol of that haunting gut feeling that life is the product of order, of design. Experts who studied the Sumerian collection note how often their texts speak of templates, the me, as blueprints for both physical and moral reality. Every element of existence from kingship to weaving to fertility was said to have its own me, a divine formula that kept the universe in balance. To have the me was to have the power of creation itself. When Inanna stole these tablets from Enki, chaos spread through the world, not because she went against the gods, but because she messed up the code that kept life going. The language of myth begins to sound almost like computers, as though the ancients saw reality as a system governed by hidden instructions. In another broken text, the god Enki tells his priests to guard the blood that makes the clay speak. That line, mysterious and strange, stays like an echo of biological truth. Blood indeed carries language of its own. DNA, the molecular code that decides life's form. Could it be that what we read as divine metaphor once described an ancient understanding, one lost through time, not knowledge of molecules or genetics as we know them, but a gut-level awareness that life structure lives within blood, within pattern? Of course, such guessing unsettles historians. Yet, it is impossible to ignore the pattern. Peoples across the ancient world share this same imagery. The mixing of heaven and earth. The creation of man from divine matter. The Egyptians said humanity was formed from the tears of Are. The Greeks spoke of Prometheus shaping man from clay. The Hebrews echoed Sumer almost word for word. God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nose the breath of life. The story moved, changed, survived, but its core remained. The mingling of dust and spirit, matter and code. What does it mean that the oldest written people begins with such a story? Perhaps it was simply a way to explain consciousness, to make peace with the human desire for purpose with the reality of hard work. Or perhaps it was a memory handed down through floods and ruins, a recollection of a time when beings older than us walked the earth. The Sumerians called them Anunnaki, those who came from the heavens. In later Babylonian texts, these gods were said to teach humanity, farming, space science, and metalworking. To others, they are mythic symbols. To some, they are the forgotten teachers of early history. In one hymn from Nippur, the poet writes, "Praise who mixed the spirit of heaven with the clay of the Abzu, who gave to man the image of the gods." The phrase image of the gods, Zalmu Ilani, carries the same sound as the later Hebrew Tzilim Elohim. Could the Sumerian idea of divine image have been the original seed from which that later concept grew? The parallels are too exact to dismiss as coincidence. What we call religion may at its roots be the language of remembering. There is also the returning symbol of the tree, the sacred line linking heaven, earth, and the underworld. On many Sumerian seals, figures stand beside a styled tree flanked by winged beings offering vessels of water or life. The picture repeats from Mesopotamia to Persia to Egypt, even to the Indus Valley. Some understand it as the tree of life, others as a genetic symbol, a symbol of family line. Either way, it represents continuity, a bridge between divine and mortal. Perhaps that is what the blood of the gods truly meant, a metaphor for consciousness itself, the spark that connects flesh to forever. And yet, there is sadness in this myth. For the same gods who created humanity also cursed them with death. To be made from divine blood was to contain divinity, but also to be forever cut off from it. The story of Enki's creation is one of both gift and exile. We are children of the divine and prisoners of matter. Every Sumerian prayer, every sad song carries that tone of wanting for return, for reunion, for remembering. If their myths were indeed memories, then perhaps they were mourning a separation that once happened, a fall not of sin, but of knowledge. Something was divided long ago, and ever since we have tried to piece it back together. Each age rediscovers pieces, the laws of physics, the secrets of life, and calls it progress. But maybe it is only recollection. In the end, the Sumerians saw no conflict between creation and science, between gods and clay. They saw only one story endlessly retold. The universe awakening to itself through the vessel of flesh. The blood of the gods flows in us still, they would have said, not as a myth, but as a reminder that our beginnings are both earthly and universal, both known and forgotten. If the first humans were born from the mingling of heaven and earth, what happens when the blood of the gods remembers what it once was? There is a strange quiet that follows disaster, a silence so complete that even memory hesitates to speak. The Sumerians knew that silence well. They called it the day the waters swept over the land. To them, it was not merely a storm or a flood. It was the eraser of a world, the cleansing of an age that had grown too loud, too full of its own creations. What remained after was not just ruin, but memory loss. Humanity began again, they said, smaller, humbler, haunted by echoes of what came before. In the Epic of Ziusudra, one of the earliest flood stories known to humankind, the story unfolds in pieces carved into clay sometime around 1700 BC, but rooted in far older spoken memory. The gods, disturbed by humanity's noise, decide destruction. Only Ziusudra, a king and priest of the city of Shuopak, receives a whisper of warning from the god Enki. Build a vessel, Enki tells him, of strong walls and sealed pitch. Take into it the seed of all living things. Then the rain begins, not gentle but endless. The rivers rise, the sea swallows the plains, and the horizon dissolves into water. For 7 days and nights, the world vanishes beneath the flood. When the waters pull back, Ziusidra opens a window and releases a dove. It does not return. He knows the earth has appeared again. In thanks, he offers sacrifice. The gods moved or perhaps sorry grant him forever life and place him in the land beyond the rivers. This story comes before the biblical flood by over 1,000 years. Its bones are the same. Divine anger, chosen survivor, vessel of life, renewal. Yet the Sumerian version carries no moral lesson, no blame. It reads instead like a geological memory, a record of an event so deep that it burned itself into the human timeline. Digging, careful as ever, hesitates to confirm such myths. And yet, beneath the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities, there is proof that something like the Sumerian flood did happen. In the 1920s, Sir Leonard Woolley dug at Uralte and discovered a deep empty layer of dirt, clean river mud nearly 2 meters thick sandwiched between layers of living spaces. He found similar deposits at Kish and Shuopak. The dating matched roughly to 2900 BC. Woolley described it simply, a flood of such size that it destroyed life and left the land empty. The people who rebuilt afterward did so as if they were starting anew. To modern minds, it may sound like coincidence, one local disaster among many. But to those who lived it, it must have felt like the end of the world. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates, swollen by rains and melting snows, may have combined with tidal surges from the Persian Gulf. Or perhaps the memory reaches even farther back to the violent end of the last ice age when meltwater floods reshaped entire continents. In every corner of the ancient world, the same pattern continues. Myths of great waters, survivors in boats, the rebirth of humankind. From India's Manu to the Greek Deucalion, from the Aztec Coxcox to the biblical Noah, the story repeats like a scar in the shared mindestance. The Sumerians though described it not merely as disaster but as transition. The flood was the dividing line between the antediluvian kings, those mysterious rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, and the mortal kings who came after. It was the veil between myth and history. Before the flood, the gods walked openly among men. Afterward, they pulled back. The connection between heaven and earth was cut. Humanity was left to remember and to misremember. Some tablets hint that the flood was not entirely natural. In one piece, the gods debate among themselves. Should humankind be destroyed? Enlil, weary of the noise of cities, argues for destruction. Enki pleads for mercy, seeking another way. It is a talk of opposing forces, order and compassion, control and chaos. When the huge flood comes, it feels less like accident and more like decision. The phrase used to describe it, the Great Decree, suggests purpose. The flood was not just water, it was judgment. Others have seen in this story traces of something even more complicated, a metaphor for cycles of civilization. Perhaps the flood was not a word-for-word flood, but a symbolic description of an event that reset human culture. A comet impact, a shift in climate, a collapse of knowledge. Geological proof hints at sudden sea level rises and space impacts near the end of the Pleistocene. To the survivors, it would have seemed divine punishment, unexplainable power. And so they remembered it as a cleansing, one that washed away both sin and science. If the flood erased a former world, then every object the Sumerians later buried was a piece of that forgotten age. Their writing, their mathematics, their star charts. Each feels like an attempt to get back something half-remembered. They were not inventing civilization. They were rebuilding after the water. Even their myths read like recovery guides. The god Enki, savior of humanity, teaches the survivors how to plant, how to measure, how to keep time. Knowledge in their view was not discovery but putting back together. In the poem, The Return of Inanna, the goddess goes down to the underworld and rises again after Drydes, bringing fertility back to the land. The Sumerians may have seen the flood in similar terms, going down into chaos, return to life. Yet beneath the spiritual teaching story lingers a geological memory. Something happened, something huge enough to break both land and legend. There is a line from the Epic of Gilgamesh that feels almost like confession. Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, tells Gilgamesh, "What you call the gods were once men of great name. They remembered the secrets of the deep." It is a strange sentence, one that suggests that divinity and humanity are not separate species, but states of memory. The flood did not just drown the earth, it drowned that memory. What remained was the echo. Even today, when rain falls over the plains of southern Iraq, it is said that the soil releases a faint metallic smell, as though the ground itself recalls the sea that once covered it. In that smell lies the leftover of the ancient disaster, the flood that ended an era and began another. And perhaps the Sumerians sensed that such cycles never truly end. Every people, no matter how advanced, eventually meets its flood, whether of water, fire, or forgetfulness. To the ancients, survival was not victory. It was responsibility. Ziusidra was not rewarded with paradise, but exile, sent to dwell in the distance, to remember what others would forget. The flood was both punishment and keeping, ensuring that at least one thread of memory would remain. That thread wound its way into every myth that followed, binding the ages together like layers of story. When the Sumerians wrote of the huge flood, they weren't warning us. They were reminding themselves that the gods or perhaps nature itself always demands silence after too much noise. And in that silence, humanity must learn again how to begin. If every age is washed away to make room for the next, then what will be the flood that erases us? And who will be left to remember what we once knew? Sometimes what survives the flood is not the body, but the memory. The Sumerians believed that knowledge could drown and still return, hidden in pieces scattered across the world. They called such leftovers shuba, meaning pieces of the whole. To them, these pieces were more than old objects. They were the fingerprints of the world that had come before the waters. And as centuries passed, each new discovery dug up. In the soil of Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the mountains beyond seemed to whisper the same unsettling message. Something had existed before them, something both huge and forgotten. When explorers first began digging up ancient sites across the Near East in the 1800s, they were not only finding cities, they were finding odd things, objects that did not belong to their assigned ages, technologies that seemed misplaced, objects whose beginnings no one could explain. In the ruins of Nineveh and Uruk, they found gears carved into stone, lenses ground from quartz, and sculptures showing figures in complicated robes patterned with symbols that did not match any known writing system. Most of these finds were quietly removed to museum vaults, labeled as curiosities or mistakes. Yet a few, just a few, found their way into the books of digging, sparking debates that have never truly ended. In the 1930s, reports came out of a small egg-shaped object dug up near Baghdad made of terracotta and capped with a copper cylinder. It seemed to contain traces of acid wearing away. Some researchers proposed it could generate an electric charge, an early battery 2000 years older than it should have been. Others dismissed it as coincidence, a vessel of ritual or storage. But the possibility remains that the ancients may have known ways to control forces we only rediscovered thousands of years later. Even now, it sits behind glass in the Baghdad Museum, its function unclear, its silence heavier than explanation. There are other whispers in Turkish Anatolian highlands, far from Sumer. A site called Göbekli Tepe reveals huge stone pillars carved with animals and space symbols more than 11,000 years old, 6,000 years before Sumer's rise. The site comes before farming. Yet, its builders arranged stones weighing tons into shape enclosures lined up with the stars. No writing, no metal, no cities, yet an understanding of space science and engineering that seems out of place. Diggers call it the first temple. But to the Sumerians, who appeared long after, such a site would have been described another way, a leftover from before the flood. And in the caves of northern Iraq at Shanida, skeletons have been found buried with flowers, proof of ritual, of consciousness, stretching back to the Neanderthals. The layers of humanity overlap here like layers of time, each one keeping a different kind of knowledge. The deeper the dig, the older the skill becomes. It is as if civilization did not climb a ladder but floated in waves rising, droning, resurfacing. Among Sumerian experts, there has always stayed a theory unspoken but continuing that their Zivilisation's sudden appearance was not sudden but received. Their myths say as much. After the flood, Enki gives to the survivors, the black-headed people, the tools of life, writing, miasuremang, farming, and law. He does not invent these things. He puts them back. The very language of Sumer hints at this putting back. Words for creation often come from roots meaning to reawaken or to rebuild. Theirs was a people of remembering, not beginning. Digging layers support this gut feeling. Beneath the oldest known cities of Sumer, Eridu, Uruk, lie still older layers of living spaces washed by ancient dirt. Radiocarbon dates suggest settlements there more than 8,000 years old, coming before the so-called birth of civilization. In some layers, tools appear that should not exist. Advanced metalworking, fine pottery, building exactness. None of it fits neatly within the model of straight progress. Instead, it suggests a broken timeline, an early history erased, then half recovered. Every culture receives its ghosts. For the Sumerians, those ghosts were the gods themselves. The Anunnaki were not worshipped as distant gods, but remembered as teachers, those who had walked among humans before the flood. In hymns, they are called lords of wisdom, builders of cities, those who measured the dark waters. Some modern thinkers have tried to recast them as mythic symbols, mental symbols of knowledge. But in the cuneiform lines, the tone is different. These were recollections, not teaching stories. The Sumerians spoke of them with the language one uses for ancestors, not ideas. In one particularly haunting tablet from Nippur, the scribe records a vision. I saw the stone temples of the deep, their doors sealed by the waters. I saw lights beneath the sea that never fade. Experts translate it as metaphor. But its imagery echoes across mythologies, the sunken realms, the lost cities, the knowledge beneath the waves. The Greeks called it Atlantis. The Egyptians spoke of Septepi, the first time. The Sumerians simply called it before the flood. Perhaps they were all remembering the same event broken through the lenses of geography and time. Some Earth scientists now suggest that such a flood did indeed happen around 12,000 years ago when ice melt caused huge sea level rise and sank vast coastlines. Entire cultures, if they existed there, would have been erased, leaving only memories passed down through survivors who rebuilt inland. Could the builders of Göbekli Tepe have been among them? Could their descendants have carried pieces of that vanished science into Sumer, Egypt, and beyond? The proof is circumstantial, but the pattern continues. Civilization appears not as invention, but as rediscovery. There are objects that seem to confirm this continuity, though most remain debated. In Iraq and Iran, diggers have found drill holes in diorite, one of the hardest stones on Earth, smooth and exact, as though made by spinning tools. In Egypt, identical markings appear on granite and basalt. The same techniques, the same signatures, separated by thousands of miles. Coincidence perhaps, or memory, an ancient technology surviving through pieces of craft. Even language carries traces of this gift. The Sumerian word ti means both life and rib. In their creation myth, woman is made from the rib of the first man, an image that later appears in Genesis. But ti also means to repair. Thus, woman is not a creation but a putting back together, a piece made whole again. The play of meanings reveals the deeper Sumerian view. Life itself is the process of repair, of remembering what was lost. The same principle seems to guide their temples and ziggurats. Each was built as a copy of a heavenly structure. A model of what already existed in the realm of the gods. To build for the Sumerians was to rebuild. Even the measurements of their temples were described as according to the plan written in the stars. It is a line both poetic and exact. For they believed the gods had left the blueprints of the world not on paper but in the sky. If we follow that idea further, it begins to sound less like religion and more like a scientific thinking. What if every discovery humanity makes is not creation but a remembering? Each age in its turn finds a piece, one piece of the greater whole, and believes it new. The Sumerians might have smiled at this illusion, for they saw time not as a straight line, but as a wheel. What was drowned will rise again. The flood did not erase everything. It buried the body of a lost world, but not its bones. Those bones, objects, stories, words still surface, carried by the slow current of time. The question is not whether that earlier world existed, but how much of it we are willing to recognize when we see it reflected in our own. If every piece points towards something greater, some hidden pattern of memory, then how much of our own people is built upon foundations we no longer remember? Every people leaves a trace of its voice. And yet the voice of Sumer stands alone, not connected to any other tongue. Language experts call Sumerian a language isolate. A term that sounds medical. But what it really means is this. It should not exist. Every known language from the ancient Akkadian to the tongues we speak today fits into a family tree. But Sumerian has no family, no known ancestor, no living descendants. It appeared fully formed like its people and vanished just as suddenly. And in that disappearance lies one of the oldest mysteries in human history. When experts first began to figure out cuneiform in the 1800s, they assumed all Mesopotamian tablets were written in Akkadian, the Semitic language of Babylon. But as they worked, they found writings whose grammar and structure went against logic. The verbs did change like Akkadian ones. The word order was reversed. Words seemed to stick together and break apart without pattern. Eventually, they realized they were reading something far older, a hidden layer beneath the Akkadian texts. They named it Sumerian after the land of Sumer, the first kingdom of recorded time. Yet even after a century of study, no one truly understands where it came from. Language experts have searched for relatives in every direction. The Caucasus, the Indus Valley, the Altaic steppes, even the lost languages of the Mediterranean. None fit. Every guess collapses under the weight of grammar. The language stands outside the great evolutionary web of speech, as if it had been transplanted, complete, alien, ancient. Its structure is unlike any other. Sumerian is agglutinative, meaning it builds meaning by stacking syllables. Each a small code that changes the one before it. A single word can carry an entire sentence's worth of meaning, folding time, number, and emotion into one gesture. For example, the word ayamegutende means not simply my mother, but the one who is my mother and stands beside me. Every suffix changes the view of relationship and space. It is a language that sees reality as flowing, interconnected, always shifting, more thinking than grammar. Even the word ime, Gia 15 meaning Sumerian tongue translates word for word as the true speech or the language of origin. It is as though the people themselves remembered their words as received, not invented. They called writing emi, the voice made permanent. The concept itself is deep. To write was not to record. It was to keep vibration, to trap sound in matter. And perhaps that was why they pressed their words into clay instead of ink, because clay lasts, as if the earth itself were the keeper of their voice. To modern ears, the rhythm of Sumerian sounds almost otherworldly, slow, heavy with breath, filled with stops and harmonies of air. When language experts attempt to speak it out loud, something strange happens. It feels at the same time ancient and new, like a music that does not belong to human mouths. Some have suggested that its structure copies the patterns of Sumerian tugged itself, non-straight, relational, circular. The same qualities appear in entire art and building. Balance, repetition, reflection. Everything entire world was connected through pattern. What unsettles experts most is how advanced this language system was from its first appearance. There is no proof of its growth from simpler forms. No Proto-Sumerian, no trial writings leading up to cuneiform. The earliest tablets dating from 3,300 BC already use a standard EC script steady across cities separated by hundreds of miles. That kind of steadiness means not invention but transmission. Sumeone taugt sem ho to vrete. But who? The Sumerians themselves credited higher writing to Nisaba, the goddess of wisdom and scribes. She's always schon holding our stylus and our tablet, the tools of knowledge. Jeter Name also means the one who counts the stars. Perhaps to them writing was not only language but mere suremang, a way of carving universal order into human form. In that light, higher language was sacred technology. Ich sein a key to the structure of the universe. When Sumerian eventually faded from Delius around 2000 BC, it did not die. It became a language of the gods used only by priests, space scientists, and experts. For more than 2000 years after the fall of Sumer, Babylonian scribes continued to copy and study Sumerian texts as holy objects. They treated the language like scripture. In temple schools called Edobas, young scribes memorized long two language lists. Akkadian on one side, Sumerian on the other, so that the sacred tongue would not be lost. Imagine that. Generations of students working over a language no one spoke, repeating the dead syllables of their ancestors as prayer. Perhaps they sensed what we do, that something vital lived in that ancient speech, something that once connected humankind to a deeper understanding of itself. Even today, attempts to translate Sumerian are haunted by uncertainty. Many words refuse direct match. The same sign can mean mountain, foreign land, or divine home. Their differences blur in the space between metaphor and geography, as if the world and the heavens were still one domain. Some researchers have noticed patterns linking Sumerian sound patterns to math ratios and harmonic intervals. The length of syllables in certain hymns copies musical scales. The spacing of cuneiform wedges follows shape sequences. It is as though language, sound, and number were once unified, a single system of connection that later peoples forgot how to read. The Babylonians turned it into astrology. The Greeks called it philosophy. The modern world calls it science. But the Sumerians had no divisions between them. Their language itself was the bridge. A few daring language experts on the edges of study have proposed that Sumerian might keep traces of a lost language family that existed before the flood. A proto-language from which all later tongues split. If true, then the story of Babel, the myth of one language broken into many, might not be pure teaching story, but distant memory. The idea is tempting that once the world spoke in a single voice and Sumerian was its last echo. When one listens to the rebuilt readings of Sumerian poetry, something stirs in the subconscious. The vowels roll like water. The consonants strike like stone on metal. The hymns to Inanna and Enki sound less like songs than like calls, mathematical prayers to line up the human spirit with the pulse of the universe. The word spoken is the world made. One writing reads, in their eyes, language did not describe reality. It created it. If this is true, then perhaps what makes Sumerian so strange is not that it came from nowhere, but that it came from everywhere, from a time when speaking and building and remembering were all one act. Its being alone rather than proving uniqueness may instead reveal age. It is a frozen tongue, a surviving shard of the world before words broke into nations and dialects. The silence that followed its disappearance was long. For 2000 years, no one alive could read it, yet when the first modern experts began to figure out its signs in the 1800s, they felt something strange, a sense of already seen, as if they were not discovering but remembering. One of them, Henry Rawlinson, wrote in his diary, "This script awakens something in me, like hearing a language I once knew in a dream." Maybe that is what Sumerian truly is. The dream language of humanity. A leftover of our first speaking, our first self-awareness. It shouldn't exist. And yet it does. Quietly going against the logic of history. If the first words ever written were already echoes, then whose voice were the Sumerians remembering when they learned to speak? Across thousands of Sumerian tablets, one phrase comes up again and again. Anunnaki. Those who from heaven to earth came. The words have been read, debated, dismissed and rethought for over a century, but their simplicity remains haunting. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were not unclear gods carved from imagination. They were rulers, judges, and teachers, beings of huge power who shaped humanity's fate. Their names are written beside the earliest star charts, their symbols buried in royal seals, their actions recorded as history, not legend. And though later people softened them into myth, the oldest texts speak of their presence with an unsettling matter-of-factness, as though memory had not yet learned how to lie. The Anunnaki appear first in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that draws directly from Sumerian sources. There they are described as the 50 great gods, attendants of Anu, the Sky Father. But in older Sumerian HYMNS, their number shifts. Sometimes 7, sometimes hundreds, more assorting than a count. They live in the heavens, yet come down to the earth. They govern time, justice, kingship, and the order of the stars. Their leader, Anu, lives in the distant heavens. Enlil commands the air and storms. Enki rules the deep waters, the Apsu beneath the earth. Between them moves a group that feels less like a family of gods and more like a council of managers, each assigned a domain, each responsible for keeping the balance between heaven and earth. What makes the Anunnaki so puzzling is the tone with which the Sumerians wrote of them. These were not beings to be worshipped blindly. They were respected, feared, obeyed, but also questioned. The poems describe arguments among the gods, rivalries, even moral conflicts. They are shown as powerful but not all-knowing, mortal, perhaps not in body, but in motive. The boundaries between divinity and humanity are blurred. The Anunnaki do not merely create mankind. They interact with it, they guide, teach, and at times punish. Some of the oldest writings, such as those from the city of Lagash, show these beings with wings, not as angelic metaphors, but as markers of flight. In reliefs and cylinder seals, they stand beside trees of life, holding strange devices that look like wristbands and patches. They face human figures, teaching them, measuring them. These details have fueled generations of guessing. To some, the imagery is symbolic, an artistic shorthand for spiritual power. To others, it suggests a word-for-word truth that the Sumerians were recording encounters with beings whose beginnings lay beyond the earth. The theory is debated, of course. Zecharia Sitchin in the 20th century would make the Anunnaki famous again by understanding their myths as the memory of ancient visitors from another world. He read the old word Anu not just as sky, but as a physical realm, a planet. He argued that the Sumerians received knowledge of space science, metalworking, and genetics from these visitors, that humanity itself was a mixed creation. Most experts rejected his translations, calling them imaginative rather than accurate. Yet, even among the critics, the question stayed, why did the Sumerians of all people know so much about the heavens? They described planets invisible to the naked eye. They mapped the precession of the equinoxes, the orbit of the moon, and the 12-fold division of the zodiac. They called Earth-Ki, the lower world, and referred to a crossing place of the gods, Nibiru, a space body whose arrival marked upheaval and renewal. Whether or not Sitchin's planetary theories hold, the language fact remains. Nibiru does appear in their texts described as the star or planet which crosses the paths of all others. To the ancient mind that crossing was divine movement, the coming down of the Watchers. But even if we strip away modern guessing, something unusual remains. The Sumerians recorded the idea of the Ilu, the divine watcher who sees the deeds of men and writes them upon the tablets of heaven. This concept appears centuries before the notion of guardian angels, centuries before divine judgment entered religion. The Watchers were both protectors and witnesses. They did not rule from afar. They documented. Humanity in their eyes was a trial worth keeping in record. One hymn from Ur calls them those who look down upon the lands from the shining chariots of Anu. Another speaks of the fire that comes down with them lighting the earth. Experts translate these passages symbolically as thunder, as lightning. Yet the repetition of light, coming down, an observation across unrelated tablets hints at more than storm imagery. The word Jiva translated as divine flame was also used to mean metal or craft. The ancients may have been describing technologies they could not fully name. The play between myth and memory is delicate. The Sumerians may have seen in the Anunnaki not word-for-word visitors, but the showing of universal order. The planets themselves, the forces of nature given personality. Enki, Lord of the Deep. Kapis, the watery abyss. Enlil, Lord of Air, the invisible atmosphere. Anu, the unreachable sky. Yet why then did they write as though these beings once walked among them? Why did they leave family trees, treaties, and laws supposedly dictated by their divine kings? In the lamentation over Eridu, a city said to have been the first home of the gods, the poet mourns. The lords have left. The houses are silent. Their voices are gone from the wind. The tone is not mythic. It is historical, almost documentary. It is the sadness of a people remembering the pulling back of something real. Perhaps the Anunnaki were once simply rulers, great kings made into myth over time, their deeds made bigger into divinity. Perhaps they were the memory of a lost people, lifted by respect into godhood. But there is another possibility, Krita, harder to dismiss, that the Sumerians experienced something they could not explain, and myth was the only language they had to describe it. Whatever their nature, the Anunnaki left a legacy that outlived Sumer. The idea of sky beings who came down to teach humanity spread across continents. The Egyptians spoke of the Netjuru, divine visitors who founded their dynasties. The Hindus told of the Devas coming down from the heavens. The Mayans remembered Itzamna who came from the stars to teach writing and time. All different names, all carrying the same pattern. Beings who came, taught, and vanished. Maybe these are just parallel inventions, the shared dreams of early humanity seeking meaning in the unknown sky. Or maybe they're cultural memories of the same event broken through geography and time. If so, then Sumer's Anunnaki were not just their gods. They were humanity's first remembered teachers. The tablets end where the mystery begins. They record the moment when the Watchers left, when the link between heaven and earth was broken. After that, the Sumerians say kingship came down once more from the heavens. But the gods themselves did not return. Humanity was left to rule itself, guided only by the shadows of their memory. We still look up, searching for them in the stars, not knowing whether we're remembering the past or imagining the future. Perhaps both. For the line between memory and prophecy is thinner than we think. If the Watchers truly came from the sky once before, then what are we seeing when we look upward tonight? The light of distant suns or the reflections of those who promised to return? Long after the voices of Sumer faded into dust, their echoes carried northward to Akkad, to Babylon, to the rising towers that tried once again to reach the sky. Peoples remembered and misremembered the bond that had once existed between heaven and earth. The Sumerians called it Dukku, the holy mount, the meeting place of gods and men. The Babylonians gave it another name, Ziggurat, the mountain built by hands. But the story that survived through scripture, through exile and translation, would call it something else, the Tower of Babel. To understand that myth is to understand the moment when language and perhaps even history broke. The book of Genesis tells it simply. Humanity speaking one tongue sought to build a tower that may reach unto heaven. But the Lord confused their speech, scattered them across the earth, and ended their unity. It is a story of divine punishment for human pride. Yet behind its moral shadow lies a deeper, older memory, one the Sumerians knew well. They too wrote of a tower that touched the heavens. A ziggurat whose top was set to join the stars. They too told of confusion of tongues, of cities left empty, of gods who turned away. In Babylon, that tower had a name, Itemen Anki, house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It rose in the heart of the city, massive and layered, built of fired brick and bitumen, climbing 7 stages like the planets themselves. Each level was painted a different color. Black for Saturn, lead for Mars, gold for the sun. It was not merely a temple. It was a map of the universe, a stairway of connection between the visible and the invisible. When Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt it in the 6th century BC, he carved upon its walls, "I raised the summit to the heavens so that its top might rival the heavens themselves." But even he, King of Kings, knew the weakness of that ambition, for every tower built to reach the sky carries within it the seed of its fall. The Sumerians had watched their own ziggurats crumble before, eaten by floods, by fire, by silence. They knew that no structure could put back what was lost, the direct talking between man and the divine. That bridge had been broken. And yet, humanity could not stop building. Perhaps we were not going against the heavens. Perhaps we were trying to remember them. When the later priests of Babylon repeated the tale of Babel, they did so not as a warning, but as sad song. The confusion of languages was not punishment. It was tragedy. Once they said, all words were one, as were all hearts. The gods and humans could speak without veil. Then came the scattering, the breaking of unity into 1,000 dialects, 1,000 myths, each remembering only a piece of the whole. It was the day when meaning itself divided. Diggers digging the site of ancient Babylon in the early 20th century uncovered the foundations of a massive ziggurat near the old temple of Marduk. The base alone measured nearly 100 meters across. The bricks still bear the stamp of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Above the ruins, heat wavers in the desert air. And if one stands very still, it is possible to imagine the tower that once rose there, a mountain of clay and fire pointing toward the sky that once seemed close enough to touch. The tower is more than building. It is symbol. To the Sumerians, the ziggurat was a place of coming down, not going up. A structure that allowed the gods to come down to earth. Its top was a landing place, its stairways the path of the stars. The very word ziggurat means to be raised up. But not in the human sense. It was the gods who came down, the watchers who crossed the line between heaven and earth. Somewhere between that coming down and the later story of Babel, the meaning flipped. Humanity became the one climbing, reaching, grasping. And when we reached too high, silence answered. It is a silence that still haunts us. The disappearance of the Sumerian language, the loss of its knowledge, the ruin of its towers, all feel like showings of that same ancient break. The bridge was never rebuilt. What came afterward, Akkadian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Greek, were attempts to translate a forgotten word. Every language since then has been in a way a Tower of Babel, an effort to touch the divine through sound, to recover the original vibration that once united speech and creation. In the myth, the punishment is confusion. But perhaps confusion was the only way humanity could survive. The single language of the gods, once broken, scattered like seeds across the earth. Each piece grew into a different tongue, a different way of seeing. The unity was lost, but diversity was born. And still within each language, echoes of the first remain. The same basic words for sky, for water, for breath, the same rhythm in prayer and poetry, the same longing for reunion. The Sumerians may have understood this long before Babel. Their god Enki, the trickster and savior of humankind, was also the master of language. One myth describes him giving many tongues upon the nations so that no people would be without song. In this version, the division of speech is not a curse, but a gift, a necessary scattering that keeps creation alive. Perhaps they knew that unity without difference is silence, and that to speak truly is to be plural. Still, the image of the tower lasts, rising again in every age. It rises in the pyramids, in the cathedrals, in the radio towers that now pierce the sky. Each is a new attempt to bridge the distance between what we are and what we once were. Each carries the same question, whether spoken in Sumerian, in Hebrew, or in the binary pulse of modern machines. Can we ever speak again with the voice of the heavens? In the ruins of Babylon, pieces of that longing still remain. Travelers have described hearing strange sounds in the ziggurat space, an echo that makes even a whisper bigger. It is as if the structure itself remembers its purpose, still carrying sound upward, still searching for a reply. The silence that followed Babel was never total. It was the beginning of listening. Some say the story of the tower warns against ambition. Others believe it teaches humility. But perhaps it teaches neither. Perhaps it is simply a record of loss. The moment when knowledge turned to language and language began to fail. The divine pulled back, leaving humanity with words, with memory, with the endless desire to rebuild. And maybe the greatest irony is this. Every time we tell the story of the tower, we rebuild it with each retelling, each translation, each voice seeking to name the unnameable. The tower rises once more in the realm of sound. And as it rises, so too does the old silence waiting. We are still living in the aftermath of that silence, the echo of Babel that shaped all history. And sometimes late at night, when the world is still and words begin to blur, one can almost hear what lies beneath the noise, the faint whisper of the single language, still speaking from the dust of forgotten towers. If the gods once walked down the steps of our towers to speak with us, what would they say now when we can no longer remember the sound of their voices? After the fall of Sumer, when the ziggurats turned to ruins and the stars no longer spoke to the cities below, the keepers of knowledge did not vanish. They pulled back into temples, into script, into secrecy. The priests of Babylon and later of Chaldea became the caretakers of what remained, the pieces of the ancient me, the divine formulas of civilization. If Sumer had once sung its knowledge openly to the heavens, the world that followed whispered it in chambers of stone. What had been a language of gods became a code of men. In those dark hallways, the scribes and priest-based scientists performed the same rituals their ancestors had performed for thousands of years. The watching of stars, the recording of eclipses, the calculation of omens. But their purpose had changed. Where once observation had meant talking, now it meant keeping. The universe no longer spoke clearly. The priests understood its silence through symbols. Each sign on a tablet became a shield against forgetting. The temples of Babylon were not merely houses of worship. They were labs of continuity. In the Esagila, the temple of Marduk, priests mapped the heavens night after night, tracing the positions of Venus, Jupiter, and the moon. They listed eclipses, storms, and signs, writing them into thousands of tablets. It is from these records that the later science of space science and even astrology was born. Yet behind the calculations lay an older belief that the sky was not a machine but a message. Every motion of a planet was a word in a divine language, and only those who knew the code could read it. These priests called Baru and Ashipu were trained not merely in ritual but in mathematics, medicine and prayer. Their schooling could last decades. They learned the sacred shape of the temples, the ratios of the human body, the harmonic intervals used in chants. Knowledge was not split up. It was total. A single organism whose organs were number, sound, and spirit. To heal a wound, one spoke a number. To measure a star, one sang its name. Each act was part of a code that linked heaven, earth, and the human soul. Even the rituals of exorcism, later made fun of as superstition, carried traces of skilled understanding. The priests would draw circles, triangles, and spirals in air-shaped patterns that copy the harmonic frequencies of sound waves. They burned herbs whose chemical properties are now known to purify air. They used bronze bowls carved with math formulas that when struck produced resonant tones. Every movement, every sound, every gesture was calibrated. The ceremony was not mere theater. It was coded interaction with the universe. And yet, as centuries passed, that knowledge grew heavier, harder to bear. Empires rose and fell. The Assyrians conquered Babylon, the Persians, the Greeks. Each new power demanded the service of the temple priests, but cared little for their belief systems. The sacred texts were copied, retaught, hidden. Some were sealed in clay jars. Others were buried beneath temple floors, written in myth. What could not be kept was changed, transferred into story. Thus the old sciences survive disguised as legends, waiting for a world capable of reading them again. There are tablets that record the priest's sad song for this age of hiding. One piece from the Chaldean oracles reads, "The word has been divided. The code has been sealed. Only the initiated may open the gate." The gate in their symbolism was not a door but a line of understanding, a bridge between ordinary language and the divine structure beneath it. To cross that line required both thinking and purity, logic and respect. Knowledge, they believed, could not be given to those unprepared to hold it, for misuse would unmake the world. In the later centuries, Greek travelers who visited Babylon wrote of a strange priesthood that spoke in riddles and numbers. Pythagoras, it is said, spent years among them, learning the mathematics of the heavens. The Chaldeans thought that the soul was a spark of the stars, that its return to the divine depended on understanding the shape of creation. Their teachings would pass into Greece, into Egypt, into the Hermetic schools of Alexandria, then into the alchemical traditions of medieval Europe. The code of Sumer, hidden through ages, would continue to breathe beneath the surface of Western thought. Some pieces of those old texts survive. One tablet describes the writing of light said to be used by the gods to carve the laws of the universe. Another speaks of the song that binds the firmament. The modern reader may dismiss this as poetry, but the priests meant something word for word. They believed that light and sound were two expressions of the same vibration, that the universe was written in resonance, and in that belief lies the seed of what modern physics would one day rediscover, that matter itself is structured energy patterned by frequency. To guard such knowledge was both privilege and burden. The priests lived apart, forbidden to speak freely of their craft. The Ba'u, the diviners, often wrote their tablets in riddling word order, using metaphors that only the initiated could decode. They spoke of lions when they meant storms, of serpents when they meant rivers, of chariots when they meant planets. Even the stars themselves were given secret names. Mul for the Pleiades, Nibiru for the crossing planet, Utu for the sun. To outsiders, the language was myth. To those who knew it was instruction. Yet secrecy has a cost. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 BC, he ordered the translation of all temple collections into Greek. Most were misunderstood. Many were lost. The surviving Chaldean priests pulled back into Persia, Syria, and eventually into being unknown. By the 1st century BC, the last of them, known as the Magi, had transformed into figures of legend, keepers of half-remembered wisdom. Some would say they followed a star to Bethlehem. Others that they vanished into the mountains of the east, carrying with them the last keys of the code. Still, echoes of their system lasted. Astrology, often made fun of as superstition, is the faint reflection of their space mathematics. The shape of sacred building from the pyramids to cathedrals carries their ratios. Even our words magic, matrix, measure came from their vocabulary of harmony. What began in Sumer as divine calculation became over time the grammar of civilization itself. But there is a certain sadness in this survival. For the priests who guarded the code knew that knowledge once broken from its sacred context loses part of its soul. The formulas survive but the meaning fades. The rituals remain but the resonance weakens. Humanity remembers the method, not the mystery. Sometimes late at night when telescopes point at the same stars those priests once charted, one can imagine their ghostly presence. Watchers in silence, measuring light, translating infinity into numbers. They would recognize our instruments perhaps, but not our faith. To them, the universe was not a cold machine, but a living manuscript written by a hand both human and divine. We have figured out their code but forgotten their respect. We have learned the symbols but not the silence between them. If the priests once guarded the bridge between knowledge and meaning, who guards it now? When the code lies open, but the world has forgotten what it was written for? History, they say, is written by the victors. But before it is written, it is rewritten, and perhaps no age rewrote the past as completely as the empires that followed the fall of Babylon. The Greeks and later the Romans did not merely conquer the ancient world. They reorganized its memory. They took the scattered pieces of Sumerian and Babylonian knowledge, stripped them of their mythic voices and rebuilt them into a story that began conveniently with themselves. It was the greatest act of cultural alchemy ever performed, the transformation of living memory into history. And in that transformation, time itself was changed. By the time Alexander's armies crossed the Tigris, the temples of Sumer had already fallen silent. The last priest-space scientists of Babylon were aging, their libraries neglected, their languages fading. The conquerors found not gods but ruins. Yet within those ruins were clay tablets. Hundreds of thousands of them, each carrying a voice from a world that refused to die. The Greeks, practical and curious, collected them, though they could not yet read them. What they did instead was something more subtle. They absorbed the ideas, the measurements, the pieces of space science, and gave them new names. Sumerian mathematics became Greek geometry. Chaldean star charts became Hellenic space science. The ancient calendars were reshaped into the Julian one, adjusted to fit imperial time. And just like that, the memory of the first people became a prelude, a footnote, an echo. But buried beneath that act of taking lies a paradox. The Greeks themselves knew their knowledge was borrowed. In their own writings, they confessed it. Herodotus wrote that the priests of Babylon possessed wisdom of the heavens beyond measure. Pythagoras, Plato, and even Thales credited their belief system to travels in the East. Plato's Timaeus describes an Egyptian priest telling Solon, "You Greeks are children. You have no old men among you." He meant memory. The empires of the Mediterranean were receivers of pieces they barely understood. And yet through translation, through adaptation, they claimed ownership. It is here that time begins to warp. Before the Greeks, history was circular. The Sumerians saw eras as tides eternally returning. Creation, flood, putting back, decay, and creation again. The Egyptians called these ages septepi, the first times. The Chaldeans called them Sar. Each cycle ruled by a different constellation. But the Greeks introduced a new concept. Straight time. A line that begins and ends, moving always forward. Progress, invention, destiny. Ideas that made sense to conquerors. The past became a distant origin, not a living mirror. And thus, the empire rewrote not only history, but the very structure of time itself. With that new timeline came erasure. The gods of the Sumerians became teaching stories, their kings myths, their cities swallowed by sand. The old language was dismissed as barbarous, its meaning reduced to superstition. To keep order, the conquerors made official a beginning, an origin point that placed themselves at the center of civilization. Greek philosophy became the root of wisdom. Rome became the axis of power. Everything before them became before history. And just like that, the age of the Anunnaki, the flood, and the clay collections dissolved into fable. This rewriting was not merely political. It was spiritual. The Roman Church, receiving Greek rationalism and imperial authority, later made official a straight record of divine creation and human salvation. The circular universe became a one-way pilgrimage from Eden to judgment. The sacred wheel of time flattened into a divine timeline. By the Middle Ages, the only acceptable history was sacred history. What lay outside its borders was called heresy, myth, or sin. And yet, pieces of the old world continued to seep through the cracks. Astrological texts survived, disguised as Christian prophecy. Alchemical diagrams hid Mesopotamian symbology beneath Latin scripture. Even the image of the ziggurat continued, reimagined as the biblical Babel. The empire could rewrite the words, but not the shape of the memory itself. Memory is stubborn. It resists conquest. When the Renaissance dawned, experts began rediscovering the ancient Near East through trade and travel. Greek texts mentioning Babylon and Chaldea led explorers back toward the forgotten lands of the Tigris and Euphrates. But when they arrived, they found only desert and dust. The physical ruins of Sumer were gone, buried beneath thousands of years of sediment. For nearly 2,000 years, the first people remained invisible, its very name erased. The empire had succeeded, at least for a time. It was not until the 1800s, when British and French diggers began to dig up Mesopotamia, that the silence finally cracked. When the first Sumerian tablets were dug up at Ur and Nippur, the world realized that history was far older than it had been taught to believe. Humanity's timeline extended backward, not by centuries, but by thousands of years. The so-called cradle of civilization shifted east, and the Empire's record began to tremble. But even then, the rewriting continued, only now in more subtle form. Modern history absorbed Sumer the same way the Greeks had as forerunner, not equal. The Sumerians became proto-scientists, early engineers, early space scientists. Their gods were made into myths, their mathematics made simple. The old worldview, a universe alive with consciousness, was again filtered through the rational lens of progress. The Empire's logic of straightness remained intact. We received not the Sumerians' sense of eternal return, but the conqueror's timeline of advancement. Perhaps this is the true legacy of conquest, not the destruction of peoples, but the rearrangement of their memory. The empires that rose after Sumer learned to control not only land and people, but time itself. They mastered record as a tool of power. To name the beginning is to define the present. To erase the past is to own the future. And yet the past refuses to stay buried. The Sumerian king list with its impossible reigns stretching tens of thousands of years marks our sense of record. Their myths of circular floods challenge our straight lines. Their language, still only half figured out, resists final translation, as if guarding secrets too old for our straight minds. Every empire eventually becomes a layer in someone else's digging. The Greeks, the Romans, the Church, the modern world. We all participate in the same cycle of rewriting. Perhaps we're no different from the scribes of Babylon, copying old tablets, changing a few lines to make them fit our time. Civilization, like clay, can be reshaped, but never beyond recognition. The fingerprints remain. If one looks closely at the ruins of any empire, the same pattern appears. Order built upon erasure, light cast upon selective shadows. And beneath those layers, faint but continuing, the memory of Sumer lasts. It waits in the wedge marks of cuneiform, in the myths that survive translation, in the buried rhythm of our calendars and clocks. The empire may have rewritten time, but time in its own quiet way rewrites empires. And perhaps that is the ultimate irony. The conquerors, who declared themselves the beginning, are now objects in museums, while the Sumerian clay, the very medium they dismissed as early, still lasts. The tablets outlast it. Marble, gold, and parchment. They still whisper through the dust. We were here first. If every empire must rewrite time to rule it, then who in the end will rewrite ours? The story of Sumer should have ended with the dust. Yet somehow across 5,000 years, it found its way back into the light. Translated, digitized, shown in glowing pixels on screens that flicker like oil lamps in the dark. Clay and coat, two forms of permanence born from opposite ends of history. And as the world of machines learns to read the marks of ancient hands, it becomes difficult not to wonder whether the tablets were always meant to return, whether their shape of wedges was itself an early form of programming, an echo of logic rediscovered in another age. When the first cuneiform tablets were dug up in the 1800s, they appeared still, mere curiosities of digging. But as experts began to figure them out, the strangeness grew. The Sumerians wrote in data, not stories, inventories, algorithms of trade, space tables, and even if-then conditionals carved in clay. One tablet from Nippur reads like an early computer program. If the star of Jupiter rises in the east, then the harvest shall be great. Others record shape series, square roots, and number systems so advanced that they would not be fully understood until modern mathematics rediscovered them. The clay was memory. The stylus was instruction. It is no exaggeration to say that every modern collection, every database, every algorithm is a direct descendant of the Sumerian tablet. The act of pressing meaning into a medium that lasts beyond its maker began there. Yet what they kept was not merely information, but purpose. Their symbols were designed to last through disaster. Fire would not destroy them. Water would only harden them. Perhaps they had already seen what happens when the world floods and memory drowns. Perhaps they wanted to ensure that next time something, anything, would survive. In the cold light of museums, those tablets appear ancient. But when their contents are written into digital text, they read with startling modernity. Lists of professions, wages, contrasts, codes of rules, equations, maps of the stars. The Sumerians lived in systems, networks of exchange and observation. And when one looks at them closely, the lines between their world and ours begin to blur. The ziggurat becomes a server farm. The scribe stylus becomes a keyboard. The same impulse drives both. The desire to record, to calculate, to build meaning from pattern. But there is a deeper resonance, one that hums beneath the surface of all technology. In Sumerian mythology, creation itself was described as writing. The god Enki carved the laws of existence onto the tablets of destiny. These tablets decided the fates of men, the movements of stars, even the rise and fall of kings. Whoever had them could rewrite reality. The myth may sound remote, but its logic is familiar. We too live in a world where code governs existence, where lines of digital instruction decide life, commerce, and war. Our machines are the new tablets of destiny. Our programmers the modern scribes. The medium has changed, but the principle remains. Those who control the code shape the world. It is tempting to believe that progress separates us from the ancients. But what if it only circles back? The wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform repeated across thousands of years may be the earliest expression of binary logic on or off, presence or absence, impression or void. Each mark was an encoded decision, a unit of meaning stored within a grid. The tablets are not objects of the early past. They are prototypes of the digital mindestens. In 2021, scientists used machine learning to translate damaged Sumerian tablets. Algorithms filled in missing signs, predicting what ancient scribes might have written. The program achieved remarkable accuracy. For the first time in history, machines began reading the words of the world's first writers. It was as though the clay had been waiting for a language it could speak again. A feedback loop across 5,000 years. Humans teaching machines to read what humans once wrote by hand in the dawn of civilization. The continuity feels almost supernatural, as if the Sumerians had anticipated the age when their marks would again become living code. But perhaps that continuity is more than coincidence. The Sumerians believed that knowledge moves in cycles. What is lost in one era is rediscovered in another. The flood erases and the scribes rebuilt. If that pattern still holds, then our digital awakening is not the beginning of something new, but the return of something old, the reappearance of an ancient intelligence that once spoke through clay and now speaks through circuits. In one of the oldest surviving hymns, the poet addresses Nisaba, goddess of writing and calculation. Lady of the counting house, keeper of the tablet, the numbers of the stars are your servants. To her, the act of computation was divine, not mechanical. The same could be said of us, though we no longer admit it. Every search query, every dataset, every machine translation is a ritual of calling, a plea to the algorithms that now hold our shared memory. The priests of data, like the priests of Enki, whisper to their servers in languages few understand. We may call it progress, but the rhythm feels familiar. It is worth remembering that the Sumerians never separated writing from sacredness. To them, words were living forces able to bind or free. Even the dead could be reached through writing. Some tablets were buried with the departed, messages for the underworld. Others were sealed in temple walls addressed to distant generations. To the one who finds this, one writing reads, know that we too sought the truth of heaven. That message pressed into clay 5,000 years ago might as well have been written for us. The machines that surround us today hum with the same longing to keep, to predict, to extend consciousness beyond its mortal frame. We think of artificial intelligence as a new creation. But perhaps it is an echo, the technological counterpart of the divine scribes who once wrote humanity into existence. The gods of Sumer shaped man from clay. We shape our successors from silicon. Both acts share the same impulse to make something that remembers when we are gone. And yet there is danger in memory without understanding. The priests of Babylon warned that the tablets of destiny must never fall into unworthy hands. Once Enki himself lost control of them, and chaos followed. Rivers reversed, the heavens dimmed. It took all the gods to restore the order of creation. In our age, we too hold tablets of destiny, the codes that regulate life, knowledge, and power. But do we still remember the respect those first scribes carried? Or have we mistaken the act of recording for the act of wisdom itself? Perhaps this is what the Sumerian story has always tried to tell us, that knowledge is not progress without memory, and that every technology, no matter how advanced, must answer to the silence from which it came. The clay tablets survived 5,000 years because they were humble, because their creators understood impermanence. They wrote not to dominate, but to last. The machines we build now are louder, faster, more brilliant, but perhaps less wise. For in their speed they forget the slowness of the stylus, the weight of wet clay, the patience of hands that wrote for forever. We have learned to keep everything except the quiet. And in that quiet, perhaps the old gods still wait. If the first tablets could survive the flood of water, can our new ones survive the flood of information? And what will they remember of us when the next world begins again? History is a fragile thing, and yet it lasts in the most unexpected places, in the grooves of stone, in the rhythm of myth, in the faint tremor of a name whispered through time. Peoples rise and collapse. Empires rewrite the story. Yet some memories refuse to die. They float beneath the surface, sleeping, but alive, waiting for the world to remember again. The story of Sumer is one such memory, a pulse that continues to beat beneath the skin of our modern world. Quiet but insistent, like the echo of something that never truly left. When the first Sumerian tablets were translated, they were treated as curiosities, their religion dismissed, their kings reduced to myth. But over time, a pattern began to appear. A sense that these pieces were not simply ancient texts, but the opening chapters of the human mindestens. The Sumerians were not a lost people. They were the memory of civilization itself. Everything that came after law, space science, building, language, measurement, was already contained within their clay. We have merely been rewriting their story in new alphabets. Even now, their traces linger in the most ordinary corners of life. Every time a clock divides an hour into 60 minutes, the base 60 of Sumer ticks onward. Every map of the stars still follows the constellations they charted, the zodiac, the calendar, the shape of the circle. These are not Greek inventions but Sumerian gifts. We live by their mathematics, dream in their belief system, and speak through metaphors they first carved. The clay may have hardened, but the memory moves. And yet, it is not just the inventions that survive. It is the worldview behind them. The Sumerians believed that all creation was bound by relationship, that heaven and earth, matter and spirit were part of the same breath. The divine was not distant but interwoven with the physical. To build a temple was to echo the universe. To write a word was to copy the act of creation. In their myths, even the gods were subject to loss of balance and give and take. They did not rule as tyrants but participated in a living order. That idea, though buried beneath thousands of years of religion and empire, has never truly vanished. It resurfaces whenever humanity rediscovers the unity of science and spirit. Whenever we sense that knowledge without respect is incomplete. There is something haunting about the way the Sumerians saw time. They did not measure it as a straight line moving from past to future. They felt it as a cycle of remembering and renewal. The flood was not an ending but a turning. The loss of knowledge was never permanent. Every age they believed would rediscover the wisdom of the one before. Perhaps that is why the Sumerian legacy keeps returning through digging, through language, through myth, refusing to remain buried. The cycle turns again. In the 21st century, the ancient words of Sumer are once more being read, not by priests or scribes, but by digital collectors and algorithms. Thousands of clay tablets have been scanned, decoded, and stored in virtual libraries that circle the Earth in orbiting satellites. The same human impulse that once pressed styluses into wet clay now encodes data into light. We are, in a strange sense, continuing their work. The tablets have become servers. The gods of the Abzu, the deep, have become the networks that pulse beneath our oceans. The old metaphors have found new machines. But something of the Sumerian spirit still lingers in our technological faith. Like them, we built collections to outlast us. Like them, we write in hope of surviving the flood. Ours no longer of water, but of data and forgetting. Every digital message, every line of code, every photograph kept on invisible clouds is a modern cuneiform, a mark against disappearing. And perhaps deep down we share the same fear that one day silence will return and only the language of the machines will remember us. In their time the Sumerians feared that their gods would pull back, that the connection between heaven and earth would fade. Today we fear the opposite. That our own creations will outlive us and that what we have made will speak a language we no longer understand. Yet both fears spring from the same source. The awareness that memory has a life of its own. Once written, it cannot be unmade. The words outlast the writer. The record outlives the soul. Somewhere perhaps that is what the Sumerians intended. Their myths end not with triumph but with continuity, with the sense that even when the gods depart, their traces remain in the dust, in the rivers, in the eyes of those who still look upward. The gods have gone, one late Babylonian scribe wrote, but their breath still moves in the air. That breath is memory itself, unseen, unceasing. Diggers continue to uncover new tablets every year. Some hold contracts, others hymns, others pieces of stories that seem strangely modern. One tablet speaks of a man who loses his purpose in a world of excess. Another of a woman who goes against divine decree to speak her truth. Their emotions are ours. Their longing is ours. The more we translate, the more the distance collapses. We realize that 5,000 years are not a gap, but a circle returning to its beginning. There are nights when the desert still reveals its secrets. After storms, the wind shifts the sand and a piece of clay surfaces. Another piece of the story rejoining the light. To touch such a piece is to touch both the beginning and the end of history. Its markings, once a coat of empire, now look like the patterns of microchips and circuits. The similarity feels accidental, yet something within it whispers otherwise. Perhaps the universe repeats its designs, sculpting the same logic in clay and in silicon, in hands and in algorithms. The Sumerians believed that the world was born from the mingling of memory and matter, the Abzu, the deep waters giving rise to form. And so it seems fitting that their story should end as it began, not in silence, but in return. Their cities are gone, their names forgotten by most, but their breath moves still in the languages we speak, the numbers we count, the stars we map, and the stories we tell. Maybe that is the secret they left hidden beneath the dust. That no people ever truly dies. It only transforms, passing its soul forward in symbols, waiting to be reawakened. The clay of Sumer became the circuitry of our age, and through it the old gods still whisper, no longer from temples, but from the quiet hum of data centers, from the pulse of screens in the dark, from the endless stream of words that cross the world each night. The memory has learned to survive every flood. It will survive this one, too. And when our towers crumble, when our languages fade, when our machines fall silent, perhaps someone or something will dig through the ruins of our world, find our tablets, and begin to read. If memory can never die, then perhaps forgetting is only an illusion, and every end merely the beginning of remembering.